Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to speak out against the steady and relentless march toward the privatization of our state's education system, sending hundreds of millions of public dollars into private institutions with limited to no oversight by the public, accountability and transparency, and where blatant discrimination under our current state law is legal. Discrimination against students from the LGBTQ+ community and students with disabilities. Private schools funded with public money where students and parents have no recourse if they are being treated unfairly. In contrast, Wisconsin's public schools, overseen by locally elected officials, must serve all kids, regardless of disability status, sexual orientation, gender, race, economic background, or learning style. And as responsible stewards of public dollars entrusted in us to uphold our constitutional rights and public accountability, it is this legislative body's top responsibility that we do all we can to support public schools first. Every kid in Wisconsin deserves the freedom and the right to attend a fully funded, fully supported public school. And yet, once again, Mr. Speaker, Wisconsin Republicans in the school voucher movement, funded by wealthy donors like Betsy DeVos and Charles Koch, are hell-bent on pitting kids, families, and education champions against one another. After a decade of pushing our public schools into positions of fiscal disaster and failing to meet the needs of our students, you show up now as if you're the heroes of the story with this deal. We are not fooled. This in front of us with this bill is one of the greatest giveaways of public money to private schools in Wisconsin history. In addition to the hundreds of millions of dollars of new spending, action taken just last night by Joint Finance Republicans will increase property taxes over the next 2 years by an estimated $647 million. Now, the gentleman from the 63rd invoked the history of Polly Williams, and I certainly would love to know, if she was still alive, what she would think about this. At the end of her career, she actually fought for limits on religious school participation, increased accountability, and she actually distanced herself from the voucher movement, the school choice movement that she built, because she had such significant reservations about the intention of the program, which was to give more opportunities to children from low-income households in the early 90s. And it was a pilot program that served a couple thousand students in Milwaukee. And the idea was to promote equity. And her history and her voice is here today. But where we are today, Mr. Speaker, is not where that dream was for Polly. And over the course of 3 decades, the voucher school system has proliferated into a system that is draining hundreds of millions of taxpayer dollars away from public schools. It's undermining support for public education and public teachers. It's failing to improve academic achievements of students, and it contributes to resegregation because, yes, voucher schools have their roots in a history of racism and segregation. There is a history there, and that might be difficult for some to hear, but the history is real, and we have to grapple with that. And all of this is happening, Mr. Speaker, without the public's knowledge of what's happening to our public money, especially in those 41% of voucher schools that close their doors and have closed their doors since taking our money. The most recent counts show that voucher programs have grown to over 50,000 students in the statewide program. And that cap is going to be lifted in just a few years. Just this year, we've spent $450 million on vouchers, And these programs have led to $230 million in aid reduction for residential school districts, thus requiring us to go back to the taxpayer if districts choose to place that revenue, that aid reduction on the levy. 20% of voucher schools in the voucher program have over 90% of their students attending on a voucher. And I would love to know, Mr. Speaker, how are schools with over 50% of their funding coming from vouchers not counted as public schools? It does not make sense to me as a taxpayer. This experiment has yet to yield any results that prove that voucher schools perform any better in the long term. To date, there is no credible evidence to show that vouchers improve academic performance. What we have in front of us is not parental choice, and you hear this a lot, and that is the way it is positioned. But in truth, this is about schools picking their students based on who they'd like to serve and discriminating against those that they choose not to. And yes, this happens over and over and over again. And just recently, 2 students from Fox Valley Lutheran High School were threatened to be expelled for being gay. This is legal under Wisconsin law. In this particular school, just this year received over almost $2.5 million in public tax money from the voucher system. Guess who can't discriminate and must educate all, Mr. Speaker? You guessed right, public schools. Educating all students, but especially those with disabilities, is expensive and it is labor intensive, and it is a burden this state has almost solely shifted back to public schools and property taxpayers. And yet, with this bill, we only reimburse public schools at the proposal at a measly 33%. Getting to 33% is something we seem to be touting here as generous, while the special needs scholarship voucher pays over 90%. I would love to know, Mr. Speaker, we had that beautiful bipartisan Blue Ribbon Commission on school funding a few years ago that had bipartisan recommendation for public school funding. What happened to it? What happened to those recommendations? If we are going to spend the time tonight talking about equal funding, we have to first commit to an equal commitment for all schools receiving public dollars to accountability, to transparency, and upholding the Constitution. Instead, where we are is a creation of 2 systems operating under 2 very different sets of standards. Mr. Speaker, when this deal was announced last Thursday, I was in my office and I got the call about the deal, and I was frantically scratching down numbers on the per pupil payments to voucher and independent schools. And in between Thursday of last week and today, those numbers have already changed. They were reported to be about $12,000 for high school voucher students, but now that's exceeding to an additional $368, and I heard that might actually be even more, now exceeding the $325 that is being reported to public schools. The more we learn, the higher the price tag. Good education policy happens when we work and listen to the stakeholders to meet our children's needs and uphold their rights. And with a $7 billion budget surplus, Mr. Speaker, we have an opportunity to take meaningful and transformational generational change. We could be funding school meals. We could be fully supporting and funding special education. We could be closing opportunity gaps. But instead, what we have here tonight is a slash and burn style of politics that pits Wisconsinites against one another under a disingenuous promise that somehow, miraculously, voucher schools are going to save us from years of dismantling and underfunding and disrespecting our public schools and teachers. I understand that public education is ambitious and aspirational, Mr. Speaker. And yes, Mr. Speaker, I understand that in many ways we haven't always lived up to those aspirations and those goals. But nevertheless, I believe we must fight for the ideals set forth and continue to march together towards justice, equity, and American democracy. And we have to fight against the privatization and abandonment of institutions of common good. The vote is read.
The question is, Senate Bill 330 having been